Good morning. What is important is that surface contact areas should be cleaned with soap and water. And so the soap and water, and you can nuance the word, they say detergent is interchangeable with soap. I honestly couldn't tell you the difference between detergent and soap, but some kind of cleanser, you should use that in water. And then they also say surfaces with high contact should be disinfected. So if we think about what gets touched on a regular basis in the bus, it's the two grab rails, right? It's the tops of the seat backs as the kids walk their way down the aisle doing this on every seat, right? And then it's the inside of the windows when all the little darlings push their noses against the window to look out, right? Or they fall asleep with their head against it, or they sneeze and they turn their head sideways. And having said that, what we probably need to do is institute, at least for the interim, a process where we are washing down some surfaces inside the bus and disinfecting them. Now, if you say, well, what do you use? The answer I got when I asked that question is, use the same products that are approved for use in the classroom. So the easy thing is go ask the custodians what it is they're using, get some of their stuff, and use the same thing. Do you need to glove up and mask up when you're doing that? What CDC says is if you're healthy, no. And so what they are saying right now is there's absolutely no reason for healthy people to wear masks, to have other barrier stuff on like gloves. And they're saying that even for EMS practitioners, folks that are picking up sick people and hauling them around, they're saying if you're healthy, you don't have an abnormal risk. It's not a life-threatening risk. So regular cleaning procedure, you don't have to glove up and gown up and do that. Now here's the interesting thing. They go one step further, and I put this in the email to try and help you in case you have a over-eager member of the community or a board or administrator who says, oh, we need to wash down the ceilings, the walls, the floors, and everything, and we need to put off fumigants inside the bus. The CDC says no. So there's no reason to do extraordinary efforts where you're washing the walls, the floors, and everything. I guess if you have somebody that wants to, you could let them, but you don't need to. And the other thing they said is really setting off some kind of an aerosol or a fumigant. I don't know, maybe you have some staff on your team that have brought in their bottles of Lysol from home at the end of every day. They go, back their way out of the bus doing this. CDC is saying don't do that. That there's actually more irritants in that will harm children than there is benefit. There's no proof that there's any benefit from doing that. So I put this out because some folks were asking. After I put it out, I had some other supervisors send me notes. Thanks for finally giving us something that's definitive that deals with the buses. It's a resource. I would say to you, just stay tuned. Those of you that get Sirius XM, they've got a dedicated channel on there that you don't even have to pay for, where they have doctors talking about this around the clock. And one doctor was on saying, we've really blown this out of proportion. We had something like an incredible number, like 4,000 deaths this year just from influenza. And the death rate from influenza is nowhere close to what's been experienced in some of the countries that are the hot spots for this. So, is it alarming? Maybe you need to decide. Will we be found wrong if something breaks out and we haven't done anything? That's kind of the standard we live and operate at, isn't it? So, whether you think this is Chicken Little saying the sky is falling, or whether we just need to, and this is what I think we need to do, just embrace this, is something else that we just need to do, get over it, do it, and move on. And that way we'll have done our due diligence. So if there is a breakout, we can say, well, it didn't happen on the buses, right? Because it's that time of year where we do tracking of the number of motorists that blast past your stopped school buses. And we've got some responses back. We try to do this the first week in March, and I do this in concert with the National Association of State Directors of Pupil Transportation. That's a group that I belonged to when I was a director here in the state. I still belong to it. And they do this national survey once a year so that we can collect this data and use it for research, for work with the various legislators to help them understand the enormity of the problem. So if you haven't done it yet, please still do it. It's not tied to one particular day. NASDAPS just wants this data sometime in March. So I figure if I give it to you on the first day of March, it gives you a month to get it done. So I'm not married. If you didn't do it last Wednesday, that's okay. You want to do it next Wednesday? That's okay. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to do it yet, if you're looking for the forms because you misplaced the email, here's where you get to them. Go to our webpage, find Transportation Services, click on the news update. Here's a link to the email that I sent out. Here's a link to the form that you give your drivers. And then here's a summary report. There's two versions. There's an Excel version and there's a PDF version. Some of your mail servers won't let you download an Excel version because they think it's a virus. So if that's the case, just download the PDF version. Or if all else fails, send Doug an email and he'll send you the form. Right, Doug? So if you haven't done that yet, please do. So what better topic to have when we're looking at a potential health emergency crisis, right? We're going to work our way through emergency transportation planning. How many of you have some kind of an emergency plan in your department? For how many of you is that part of your driver's handbook? How many of you have a separate procedure book that's just for the emergencies? Okay, some of both. And it works however you do it. Here's our goal for today. I want to walk you through the hierarchy of emergency transportation planning, and we're going to talk about some principles, some guidelines, why we do it. Very briefly, we'll talk about the law, but at the end of the day, the law is not why we do it. We do emergency transportation planning to help the operation run smoother when things don't go as planned. Okay? That's what it boils down to. For those of you that already have a plan, this is a great tool to help you take a step back, look at your plan, figure out where it's good and where it could use just a little bit of massage work. All right? And so you can twist it, adjust it, and build on it. For those of you that don't have a plan, my goal today is to give you the tools to start building your plan. So an emergency transportation plan, in a lot of ways, is like your department handbook. You cannot sit down and do it in one afternoon. It's much bigger than that. Okay? So we're going to do some process stuff today. We're going to talk about how you work your way from where you are now to where you want to go. And then my intent for today's class is to send you home with the tools that you can either enhance the plan you have or start from scratch if you don't have one. But the goal is that you have what you need in your toolbox, that you, as you move forward, you can start building and enhancing your own emergency plan. Now, I will say one thing with regard to that before we jump in. Emergency planning takes stakeholders. It takes more than just you at your desk with a legal pad in front of you. We're going to talk today about who the stakeholders are that will help you, but I will also say to you that the stakeholders are the other folks in the room today. Talk to other school district staff, and most importantly, I would encourage you, if you're doing a new planning procedure, to bring in folks from the districts around you. Because at the end of the day, if you have an emergency, it affects them. If they have an emergency, it affects you. And probably the same bad things can happen on both sides of the district line, right? So we're all in it together. We might as well try and solve it together. So what's our risk? So if we quantify our business, 440,000 buses, 23.5 million students every day. Here in Ohio, 15,000 buses on the road every day, 800,000 students. So now, here's the significance of 800,000. In Ohio, we educate between 1.3 and 1.4 million children every year. Now, that number fluctuates based on whether you include homeschooling, community schools, the non-chartered schools, and that's why there's a range there of about 100,000. But let's take the higher number, 1.4 million students educated. Look how many we have on a bus every day. More than half of them. More than half of them. How long are those children on a bus? Well, anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour and a half twice a day. Some children in rural Ohio, especially the elementary and the kindergarten children, are on the bus as long as they're in the school building. Okay. We're driving 1 million miles a day. 1 million miles a day. If you do the math, and if I did it right, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 round trips to the moon and back every day. So when your drivers come in at the end of the day and they say they're worn out, that's why, right? Neil Armstrong's got nothing on us. And then we do another 18 million miles per year on field trips. Right? That's not chicken feed either, right? So we are all over the place. All over the place. Each year you put all these miles together, 369 round trips to the moon. Now when you compare the passenger miles that we travel in school buses with passenger miles in any other industry, no one comes close. Not airlines, not rail, not buses, and not public transit. So we've got more passenger miles than any other mode of transportation. If you look at vehicle safety records, and the way I pull this data, this is national data. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration runs a database that's called FARS. It's the Fatal Accident Reporting System. And what that does is it pulls data from any crash with a fatality anywhere in the country. So it gets reported to NHTSA. And then if you work with the data, there's nothing in there that says you can't, hit a search button that says, tell me how many kids died on the way to school. It doesn't do that. But what you can do is say, let's look at students, let's look at children, if you will, between the ages of 5 and 18. So we got kindergartner, we got seniors, and then let's bracket this to certain times of the day. And so if we say 6 to 9 in the morning and 1:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon, what have we done? We've covered the school transportation hours. And so if we look at that data, figure out how many children are dying every year during those times of the day, is pretty much school related. And so what we learn is that in passenger cars, it's about 3,000 children per year. This is nationwide. It's not Ohio, so it's nationwide. Light trucks, minivans, SUVs, it's about 1,400 children per year. Pedestrians, so even the children that are walking to school during these hours, and we've seen this here in Ohio, right? We've got children being struck while they're walking, 573 fatalities per year. Bicyclists, 264. Somewhere there's a kindergartner riding a Goldwing. There's 134 of them. You add it all up, and it's about 5,500 fatalities per year. Now, I will tell you, this data is specific to one particular year. Right? It's 2008. But I will tell you that when you look at this data every year, it hardly changes. So, the numbers go up 5, 10, 15, 20, but the ratios are fairly consistent. So when you look at all these vehicles, 5,500 fatalities per year, the vehicle that's missing is obviously the school bus. And so if we add school bus to this, we add 3 more. Now, you and I will agree very quickly that 3 is 3 too many. But if you look at that 3 comparatively with the other modes of travel, where should a child be when they're going to school or coming home from school? Clearly inside the school bus. Now, some of you will say, well, gosh, I saw an article, and in this particular year there were 22 children killed. There are catastrophic events that happen, like Fox River Grove, right, where a bus was parked across the train track. Train hit the bus, and we lost 22 children. There was a quarry accident in Texas where Dr. Pepper truck T-boned a bus and pushed it into a quarry. We lost a bunch of kids there. There have been a few of these catastrophic things. But in general, if you take the isolated cases out there, we're looking at 3 fatalities per year in a school bus. That's a win. Right? That's a win. School bus transportation clearly is the safest mode of transportation. It's the best way for children to get to and from school. Notwithstanding those facts, and here's where you get the sucker punch, bad things happen. Right? So let's look at some of those bad things just to help us get back down to earth and realize that we do have something we have to manage, and then we'll figure out how to manage it. So before we run into this, Ohio crashes, and I track school bus crashes every year here in the state of Ohio. Any of you can get that data. It's online, available from the Ohio Department of Public Safety. When I started tracking this in 2000, when I went to work for the state, we were hovering around 2,000 bus crashes per year. That number is now down to between 1,200 and 1,400 per year. So we've done well. We've done well. In 16, 1,200 bus-involved crashes, of which almost half of them, it was the bus driver's fault. Now, let's be very, very clear. That doesn't mean the bus driver was cited. All right? When you have a crash, and somebody just asked me this question about a BMV report just 2 days ago, you might pull up a BMV report and see 4 or 5 crashes. It says accident, and that's all it says. If there's no citation listed on the same date, they weren't charged. Right? That doesn't mean the bus driver wasn't at fault. It simply doesn't tell you that. Right? So we have to talk about chargeable. We have to talk about at fault. But then you and I operate at a higher standard. Our standard is, was it preventable? Was it preventable? And so we have a couple of goals when we look at this data. One is, where the driver was found to be at fault, we have to fix the problem. Whether it was a driving style, whether it was a problem with the route sheet, whatever it was, we had to figure out what went wrong and we had to fix it. Where it was a case that it could have been prevented, and many accident reconstructionists and the engineers that look at this stuff will tell you that they believe almost every crash can be prevented, then we have to figure out how to prevent it. And so that's why we look at this data. Figure out where the problems are happening so that we can enhance training programs, enhance bus stop assignment procedures, enhance how we design routes so that we can move towards preventability. So what's interesting here is if you look at the data, whether a car was parked illegally or not, if it was parked and we hit it, it was probably not the car's fault. Agreed? And then we also like to hit all kinds of other things that aren't moving. Traffic signs, poles, posts, trees. How many of you have come in and had a driver tell you that a tree reached out and grabbed their bus on the way by? Right? I know, I was there too. right? It happens. Low-hanging branches, instead of asking the city to prune them, we like to just whack them with the front of the bus and see if they'll break off, right? Stuff like that happens. Probably many of you in this room, if you've been doing this for more than a year or two, have had to buy a mailbox or two, right? They love to get underneath the back bumpers of school buses. But interestingly enough, if you look at all this, again, if we look at patterns, in this year, there was only one case where a mechanical defect was listed as primary cause of a crash. So what that says is our maintenance programs are really good, right? Some of our buses are really old, but we're doing a good job keeping them together. What it also says is the pre-trip inspection as a concept works. Are there holes in it? Are there things we could do differently or better? Undoubtedly. But in general, it works. You look at this many crashes and there's only one vehicle defect? Really, that's phenomenal. So what do we need to do? We need to focus on training scenarios where we deal with all these inanimate objects that keep running out and grabbing our buses. Okay? All right, let's talk about some real things that have happened. This one happened in the early 2000s. I can't remember exactly where, when. This is Monroe County, which is the county directly above Toledo. So Toledo sits at the top of the left corner of the state. Then you get our friends in blue, right, that live across the line. Monroe is the big county right above Toledo. It's fairly rural. And I distinctly remember this one because we were at an OAPT conference here in March in the spring. And all of a sudden, that's back when we were wearing pagers instead of cell phones. Everybody's pager starts going off, and we heard that there was a mass casualty incident somewhere in the Toledo area, and OSP was rolling their crisis management team out there, their mobile command center. Well, when it all shook out, it was in Michigan. We had 2 school buses on a field trip, both loaded with children and chaperones, and one of them got broadsided by a tractor trailer carrying a legal limit of steel. So we're talking heavy truck. T-boned the bus. I had an opportunity to interact with the sergeant up in Michigan that oversaw the unit that did the investigation, and she said the minute you saw the bus, you knew it was a Freightliner truck that hit the bus because it had that distinctive V notch in the side of it that Freightliners have. So here's the amazing thing about this crash. No one died. Everyone walked away. So, can the crash happen? Absolutely. Are our vehicles constructed in such a way that they protect kids? They sure do. All right, there was some bleeding, there's some cuts, there's some broken bones, but no one died. Right? Very significant. This is a crash from Southern Ohio. When we talk about the crash worthiness of school buses, there's forward impact protection, there's side impact protection, there's rollover protection. Probably the worst place you can hit a school bus is on a corner, because then you're getting into some other things. How many of you have had a car or a pickup truck or something else strike one of your buses? So who always wins in that crash? The bus, right? So here's a case where a small pickup truck went left to center and struck the driver's corner of the bus. Obviously not much left of the truck. They had to sweep it up with a broom. The bus, although probably won't get its inspection sticker at its spot, right, is still very much a bus. And look at the passenger compartment of that bus, not distorted at all. So that was a significant moment of impact. A lot of energy dissipated here. Interesting case here is that there was only one injury among the children on the bus. There was a kindergartner who was sleeping on the floor in the back. And when the bus came to a rather abrupt stop, it was kind of like what the balls where the machines where you sit there with the flipper pinball. Yeah, it was kind of, the child was kind of like a pinball and kind of wound its way up through the seat legs to get to the front. So that child had some bumps and some bruises and some injuries, but no one else on the vehicle was injured. So again, the design of our vehicles is really solid, but it starts to help us to become more aware that seating position is part of the success of the safety of a school bus, right? A child sleeping on the floor is not protected. They recognize what kind of bus that is, the manufacturer? They're not made anymore. Carpenter, very good. So this was sent to me by my counterpart in Florida when he and I were both still state directors. This was on I-10. And he shared this with all the other state directors right after it happened. This was what set off the industry concerns about Carpenter school buses. So if you look at this bus, it went on its side and then on its roof, it's no longer shaped appropriately. That's not what's supposed to happen to a school bus. School bus design is that you have ribs on either side. For most of your buses, that rib is where the window posts are. So you got a steel beam going from the ceiling down to the floor. And then the roof is also on ribs. Some of the manufacturers, it's a one continuous extrusion. Runs from the floor up, across the top and down. Others build them separately and then weld them together, much like your house is built. Okay, you have studs in the walls holding up the walls. And so the bottom of the stud is on the floor. Then on top of the stud, you put another plate, and then you put the roof rafters across them, and that's how you build the house. Well, what they discovered in the Carpenter is that some of those studs in the walls didn't make it down to the floor. It seems like they were cutting corners on their steel costs, and so some of those side posts were actually shorter than the height of the bus. And so really it was just two sheets of sheet metal that are holding the studs in place instead of the studs holding the sheet metal in place. And then they also discovered that there were some faulty welds because they were doing spot welds. They weren't fully penetrated into the metal. And so when the bus rolled over, right over the driver's head and below the driver's seat, there's some key welds that would break. There was another weld right above and behind the doorway that would break. And the bottom line is when you rolled these buses on their side, they kind of turned into a jelly roll. And they just conformed to the ground as they went over. Right? That's not good. That's also not compliant with the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards and design standards that cover our school buses. Now, by this time, when this crash happened, Carpenter had gone out of business twice. They went out of business first time, someone bought them. They started rebuilding those things in, of all places, a tank factory in Indiana. That didn't last very long, and they went out of business again. So there really was no way for us to get factory assistance on this thing. So most of these Carpenter buses have now gone to one of the quarries in the state that tend to be graveyards for school buses, or some of them have been driven to South America in the long caravans of the exports. Right? So again, something that could happen. And then this. This was our one fatality inside of a school bus in 5 decades. Happened just a little bit east of here. This was a worst case scenario. We're on a rural route with drainage ditches on both sides. And the right front wheel of the bus left the roadway. So now if you think about these rural roads with these drainage ditches on the side, and you think about the length of the wheelbase, once that right front wheel goes off, guess what? The bus is going to follow it. And even if, as a driver, you're cranking on that wheel and you got both hands and you're pulling on the left side trying to bring it back, if you're moving 45, 50 miles an hour, the bus is going in the ditch. So that's what happened here. The bus went in the ditch. And this was a worst case scenario. You know, they talk about the 100-year floods that are supposed to never happen when they build bridges and spans across creeks. They say, well, this will survive the 100-year flood. Well, this was the 100-year crash that's not supposed to happen. The bus went on its side, then on its roof, back on its side, then it slid forward. It snapped 2 utility poles before it stopped against the third one. So we've got crash impacts on this vehicle from the side, the top, the front, and it ended up in a catastrophic vehicular failure. The right front corner of the bus crushed all the way down to the top of the seats. Now, one of the standards in FMVSS is that if you flip a bus on its roof, the roof's only allowed to crush 7 inches. Right? And that's by design so that we maintain headroom between the tops of the seats and the roof. Well, in this case, there were too many forces. And so that bus crushed all the way down to the seat. We lost the child in the front seat on this bus. Child was sleeping on the bus with his feet in the aisle. And as the bus rolled over, you know, if you're asleep, you have no natural protection instincts. And so the child ended up, unfortunately, perishing after being caught between the top of the seat and the roof, and we lost that child. So there were other children, 7 kids on the bus, 1 sleeping in the right front seat. Most of the others were sitting in the back. They were sitting up and awake. They weren't harmed. Right? And so the conjecture is because they were sitting up and awake, they were able to use their arms to protect themselves and catch. So this happened on my watch as a state director. I went out there, and I have a whole set of slides from this bus that we're not going to look at today. But, you know, I walked away from this thinking, and I'm from southwestern Ohio. Remember thinking that, you know, that comment that Fred Annis drilled into my drivers should have been in place on this bus. And that is seat on seat, back on back, feet on the floor. And I have to tell you that over the years, Fred trained hundreds of my drivers. And they'd come back and they'd share that with me. And I'd say, okay, and just let it go. And I'll confess that before this crash, I didn't get too uptight about children sleeping on the bus. I was riding a route in Ripley, Union, Lewis. So that's a riverside district. It's all the way down on Route 52 on the Ohio River. And I had to be down there at dark o'clock to ride with this driver. I remember going down Route 52 and see all these bright lights on the reflectors on the side of the road. I said, wow, they got great reflectors down here. He said, no, those are deer. All right. So we see the lights flashing off their deer. And then down there, and some of you have districts like this too, all the routes go straight up and then straight down, and then straight up and straight down. I mean, you can't get a ride like that at Kings Island. Well, so it's an hour-and-a-half route, and we're picking up little people. And at one point, I'm sitting behind the driver, and I look up in her big mirror, and there's all these lights blinking inside the bus. And I asked her, I said, what is that? And she said, it's their shoes. Right? The little ones get on the bus, and they lay down, and they finish sleeping. And so they all got these little lights in their shoes at the time. They're all blinking in the aisle. And I thought, how cute, right? And I never thought twice about it. And then this crash happened. And it got me to thinking about seat on seat, back on back, feet on the floor. The irony of this crash was the same day this happened, we were fighting a seatbelt bill here in Ohio, and the legislator that had sponsored the bill stood up in committee in the House that day and had, I don't know what it was, but she says to the committee, had you guys listened to me when I first introduced this bill and put seatbelts on this bus, this child would be alive today. And that's just a ridiculous comment. Because we don't know. Would that child be alive today? Maybe. Would that child have been sleeping on the bus and not wearing the belt? Maybe. We don't know. So this is one, and I, at the time, I was working closely with one of the engineers at NHTSA on the crash reconstruction on this. NHTSA decided not to even study this one. NTSB didn't study this one because they said there were so many isolated, it's like the 100-year flood. I said, you could not design around this kind of a crash. And so here's a case where, would a seatbelt have saved Casey? We don't know. And I can't help but coming back to this crash, because this was in my experience, when we look at what happened in Chattanooga and when we look at what happened in Baltimore, when NTSB gets involved and says, okay, here's what's right, here's what's wrong. That case and here, before I get off the seatbelt thing, because I always get stuck on it, the crash in Chattanooga, excuse me, they did a plot of all the children in the bus to show who died, who survived, and who was critically injured. And the children at the point of impact where that bus hit the tree survived. And in NTSB's report, it says because they were thrown clear of the point of impact. There are other children on the bus that died. Now, NTSB's takeaway from all this is we need seatbelts on buses. But when you ask them, and I had an opportunity to interact with the lead investigator on this case, and I said, what would have happened to those children at the point of impact if they'd been in a belt? And the answer is it would not have been good. Right? So here's a case in Chattanooga. Had there been belts on the bus, we would have been looking at 3 fatalities from children that were in those seats where the tree and the bus came together. The other children on the bus probably would have been safe. So, did we gain anything? Hard to say. And then this happened in Missouri. It's a little bit west of St. Louis. We got 2 buses on a way to a field trip. They're headed to Six Flags. They're both full, traveling in rush hour. Heavy construction traffic backs up. Both buses were traveling in the right-hand lane. The lead driver in the caravan made a traffic decision. Traffic's backing up. Lead driver decides to move one lane to the left. Right? In the process of switching lanes, that driver is distracted because on the curb up ahead is a highway coach, like a Greyhound or a Trailways, with people offloading. So you got a bus parked on the side of the road with people walking around. So the bus driver's attention goes like this. And in that split second, traffic in the lane the bus was moving into comes to a stop. So you got this semi-tractor without a trailer. You have what you can't see here, a yellow pickup truck that was behind the truck that struck by the bus, curled up into a ball, and pushed up onto the bed of the semi. Bus number 2 was following bus number 1 so closely that those 2 buses hit before the driver even realized they were coming to a stop. So, we all work in a state where there is no such thing as highway construction. Not a barrel to be found anywhere in Ohio. Right? Maybe not. Here's something to think about when we do driver training. Is there a value in hopping lanes in rush hour traffic and construction? Are you going to gain any ground? What about driver attention? Where should we be looking? How many of you teach what's called the Smith system, where eyes move all the time, and you scan, you move, you scan, you move, and you process things and you keep moving? Target fixation is what happened here. Obviously, there was a problem with following distance for the lead bus and the truck. So what do they teach us in pre-service class about following distance? What's the rule?
1 vehicle for every 10 miles
Mm-hmm.
per hour.
Yep. So they teach it that way, and then sometimes I've seen it taught where you count to 4 on a good day, you count to 7 on a less than good day, and that's how much distance should be between you and the vehicle in front of you. So what happens in a school bus in rush hour if you leave that kind of following distance? Someone cuts off the bus, and what happens to the bus? It just keeps backing up, right? So there's not a whole lot of reinforcement for bus drivers to leave appropriate following distance. That said, that following distance is still critical in a bus so that we have time to react and come to a stop. I will say, having grown up as a band parent and driving the band truck for my child's marching band for 4 years, maybe it was tainted because the bus drivers there knew what I did for a living, but I found that the lead bus driver is always really good on the highway about following distance. And so I never had anything to say but positive comments to our bus drivers in our district about following distance. Now, let's talk about buses 2, 3, 4, 5 in that yellow snake going down the road. What do buses do when they're in a caravan going down the road? We get really close so no one can get in between us, right? Unfortunately, that's what happened here. Bus number 2 was so close to bus number 1 that bus number 2 didn't even know there was a crash until after it had happened. I will tell you, during my 20 years as a supervisor, I had more than one case where a school bus rear-ended another bus on school property. And it's harder than heck to explain to your superintendent why this happened, right? But it happens, right? Because we tend to get complacent about the vehicle in front of us, especially when it's one of our fellow bus drivers. Things to think about. Anybody had a bus fire in their fleet? They happen, right? We have 1 or 2 of them every year here in Ohio. There's somewhere between 20 and 30 of them across the country every year. They make the news when they do happen because everybody thinks that these things are supposed to be boilerplate and they can't hurt. You know, we had the tragic fire on a bus in Iowa now 2 years ago. 1 driver and 1 student. The bus burned and both perished in that. Pretty hard to understand. So we do have fires. So just a teaching point. What happens? What do you tell your drivers to do if they think the bus is on fire? Get out. Right? How many of you have had a training exercise with your drivers where you bring in the fire department and you teach them how to use fire extinguishers? Have you done that? Kind of fun, isn't it? Makes a mess. Principal will never let you back on their property after you've done it on their lot. Don't do it on a football field. But
Let them start a flare. I have never started
Yep.
a flare in my life.
Yep.
Most of my drivers have.
That's another great exercise. Have them light a road flare and teach them where to hold it so it doesn't drip on their nylon, right? But here's the thing about those fire extinguishers, and I say this to you as a veteran of the fire service. I spent 13 years in the fire service. If you have a bus on fire and you have a driver and a bunch of kids, you tell them to get the kids and get off the bus and watch that baby burn. You are not going to put out a burning school bus with a 5-pound fire extinguisher. It won't happen, right? Those fire extinguishers are only good for little fires. Worst case scenario, a driver gets a new bus out of the deal, right? What you don't want is one of your drivers getting further harmed, hurt, or injured because they're trying to fight a bus fire with a toy. This was in Seneca County. Some of you may know more about this than I do. Had a 17-year-old texting that rear-ended a bus. So what happens when a car rear ends a bus? It submarines, right? It goes underneath. So it's really bad for the driver in the car. Because what have we done? We've eliminated the whole head zone in the passenger compartment. And so this is a fairly common picture when we have cars that run into buses. The irony of this case was just weeks before this crash, the same student was reported for texting and driving and going around a stopped school bus. So when we talk about our role as educators, we are far more than just a transportation department. We're not just bus drivers. You know, and as a school district, we're not just teaching the classroom subjects. We have to talk about safety and safe driving and driving practices. So this is not necessarily a training area for our bus drivers, but it is something that could happen to one of your drivers. So we have to be prepared to handle it. But this also gets us in this mindset of what could happen and what could we do to mitigate this in our district. This one happened out here in Licking County. Anybody ever had a bus and a deer encounter? So here's a case where driver was empty, school bus was empty, she's going down the roadway. Car in front of her, small car, hits a deer, acts just like a wedge, throws the deer up in the air, comes over the hood of the bus and into the windshield and lands in the aisle next to the driver. Free steaks for a year, right? Scary, no one hurt. But we do have deer wandering around in Ohio, especially a couple times a year. Weather issues, tornadoes, snowstorms. In your district, let me ask you real quickly, do you know what to do if your buses are loaded up in the afternoon, they're in the front driveway at the middle school, and the tornado sirens go off? Do you know what to do? Do your drivers know what to do? Is the principal outside at the building standing, get away, get away, get away? Yeah, because they don't want you anymore, right? So here's the case where our emergency plan needs to include, what do we do with the students? Do they go back inside and shelter? Do we take them home? Do we take them somewhere else? So here's a prime example where your emergency plan has to be in sync with the building's plan. And if they're not hooked up together, things get a little ugly. Because you'll have staff at the building say, get away from us. And the driver's saying, I don't want to take this bus on the road. There's a tornado coming. Right? So everybody has to be on the same page.